Great. Thank you. Welcome and thanks for joining us today. We are really excited about the powerhouse panel that we have today. First, just a little bit of housekeeping. We've been able to close captioning for this webinar, which you can see and or adjust by clicking on the box at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded and live streamed on CMAP's Facebook page. And we've also set aside some time at the end for audience questions. So please submit your questions in the Q&A box, which my colleagues will be monitoring. We'll have a little bit of time and we'll answer as many questions as we can get to. So to start, we are delighted to include 4 remarkable women in today's roundtable to discuss what an economic recovery means for the region's women and how challenging structural inequities will build stability and opportunity for women and their families. It's no accident that we're hosting this discussion today on International Women's Day, a day whose purpose is to uphold women's achievements, recognize challenges, and focus greater attention on women's rights. We have with us here today United States Congresswoman Lauren Underwood, representing Illinois' 14th District. Congresswoman Underwood will be joining us in about 15 minutes due to a scheduling conflict. Dr. Helene Gayle, President and CEO of the Chicago Community Trust. Karen Freeman Wilson, President and CEO of the Chicago Urban League. And Noreen Shugru, Director of Research for the Latino Policy Forum. The COVID-19 pandemic has wreaked economic havoc across demographic lines, but women and working mothers have been particularly hard hit. As of January, more than 2.3 million women had left the US labor force since the beginning of the pandemic, compared to 1.8 million men. This has brought the women's labor force participation rate to their lowest level since 1988. And this is a result of many differences and converging pressures that have disproportionately impacted women. The pandemic's disruption to schools and daycares, structural inequities, and the need for family-friendly policies. Research shows that women of color, young women, and mothers face particular challenges in shouldering both work and caregiving responsibilities. When you dig deeper into national unemployment rates, you really start to see the disparities emerge. Women with disabilities, young women aged 20 to 24, Hispanic, Black and Asian women all experience higher unemployment rates than the national average of white men. And this is particularly true for those working at the intersections of disadvantaged identities like women of color, mothers, and those with disabilities. In January, for example, there was 5% fewer Black women in the US labor force than in the previous year, compared to a 3% drop amongst white women. In Illinois, the state data mirrors national trends. Illinois' women are experiencing higher unemployment than their male peers, with approximately 250,000 fewer women employed in 2020 than in the previous year. The Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago found that the steepest declines in employment were amongst Black mothers, single mothers, and moms with no more than a high school education. And the key word in that sentence is really mother. Despite changes in the division of household chores and family care over the past few decades, American women still spend, on average, 2.5 hours per day on household activities compared to 1.9 hours per day for men. Mothers working full-time also spend 50% more time each day caring for children than fathers. During difficult times like we've experienced this past year, cultural expectations can be readily apparent. Another report from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago found that women with children suffered greater job losses throughout 2020 than other groups, including fathers and women without kids. So to dig into this data and talk about their implications to women, our state, I look to our panelists for insights. So again, if you have questions, please submit them in the Q&A box and we'll answer as many as we have time for. So starting with you, Karen, could you comment on the particular challenges facing our region's Latinas and Black women? Why are they particularly burdened with these challenges?
Well, when you listen to, first and foremost, let me thank you, Erin, for assembling this panel and for the opportunity to participate. You've laid out the statistics extremely well. And when you think about the fact that women don't get the luxury of focusing on one thing during COVID, their health, or they don't get an opportunity to simply focus on whether they're employed or not, or whether they have a change to their housing status or not. Women have to focus on all of these things at the same time, and to ensure that their children are continuing to learn, to address the challenges in education, to address the challenges on their job. You know, by our very nature, yes, we are multitaskers, but multitasking in the era of COVID, that's taking things to an entirely different level, but that's what women had to do. And so the one thing that we didn't talk about is the added stress that comes with that, and how that impacts women's ability to really navigate all of this new terrain. And I think that's what we're seeing. That's what we've certainly seen with the Urban League. Last May, we published COVID-19, an epidemic of inequities, and talked about the social determinants of health that really have exacerbated the incidence of COVID and death from the disease that has been particularly more apparent and disparate for women.
Thanks, Karen. Noreen, how about you? Same question. You know, why is this? Oh, you're on mute still.
As Karen said, I'd also like to thank you for doing this, and the forum is very honored to be participating. And I also agree that you've laid out the statistics very well, and they present a vivid picture. But when you think of Latinas and Black women, I think the statistics are missing a picture. And that's what makes this even worse. So many of these women are also in the cash economy. And a lot of these statistics are not taking into account what has happened to the cash economy. The other thing that is particularly troubling is we look at this fluctuation, which is really statistically so trivial to be non-existent, between Black and Latina women. And people are talking about women of color as if they're somehow interchangeable parts. There are very specific stresses that Black women, Black moms face that no other group faces. The same is true of Latinas. There are commonalities, but there are also structural differences that really hurt both of these women. And while the statistics are important and lay out a pattern and really put in everyone's face the structural inequities, I think they miss the richness of it unless we take a deeper dive into how these women really live. The reality is that a lot of these women who are on unemployment are working in the gig economy. They may be working 3 and 4 jobs. And that's what's missing. And we know that. We know that from the research. We know that from the people we talk to. And somehow that's got to be brought to the forefront. And both philanthropy and government need to figure out how to help these women, not with some broad set of policies, but with the realities of their daily life.
Thanks, Noreen. That's really, really good points. Dr. Gale, how about for you, from your perspective?
Yeah, well, along with my colleagues and panelists, also just want to thank you for convening this incredibly important discussion. And I think they've really covered it very well. You know, I think as somebody who, as an epidemiologist, studied statistics and numbers, you know, it is important to have that context. But I also think it is so important for us to, you know, visualize what does it mean to be a single-headed a home where you're the single breadwinner, and you're working in an economy during COVID where you lose your job, and you have to think about whether or not you make the choice between paying your mortgage, paying for medical care for a sick relative, getting food on the table, all of these choices that are very real choices that, you know, we are seeing, particularly during this COVID moment, when, you know, people use the term left the workplace. You know, people aren't leaving the work, and some people are making the choice to leave the workplace, granted. And you know, we know that there are women who are leaving employment because it just gets too much. But those are often women who have options. You know, there is somebody else in the home who has an income stream, and so they're leaving in order to take care of children, to school children, et cetera. But, you know, a lot of what we're talking about are women who have no choice. They're not leaving the workplace. They're being let go. They don't have employment. They don't know if they're going to be able to keep a roof over their head when the moratorium, the eviction moratorium is over. You know, these are the really tough choices. And I guess, you know, we focus a lot on these issues at the Trust of wealth inequality. We do a lot of policy work around these issues. And I just want to scream sometimes to policymakers who are making choices about people's lives and forgetting the real toll and impact of what does that mean if you have to worry in the middle of a Chicago winter whether you will have a roof over your head and food to put on your table. So I just want us to always, one of my mentors used to always say, you know, remember the faces behind the numbers. And if we keep that context, the macro of how this is hurting people, but always remember those faces behind the numbers, I think it means we will do the right thing by people who are being so impacted at this moment in time, of which women are bearing, and particularly women of color, are bearing the greatest brunt.
No, that's a really important point, that this is people, not just numbers, of course. Karen, it looked like, did you want to weigh in on that too a little bit more?
You know, I love what Helene said, because it really is, there are people who are impacted by the policies. That's, you know, that's how I say the same thing. And so often, and I'll give you an example. You can say that a kid hasn't been on screen, and you can make a decision to punish, you can't punish the kid, so you can make a punitive decision that's directed at the parent. But when you find out that the parent has to work 12 hours in order to keep the roof over the kid's head, then, you know, okay, what decision do you make now? And I think that's why the mayor pushed so hard to get folks in school, because she understood the difficulty of those choices that were having to be made in households around the city every day, and the impact that it was having on families, particularly women who are leading many of these families.
I think what both have my fellow panelists have really indicated is that far too often, and this has been exacerbated in COVID, we are blaming the victim. And our policies are structured, and the evaluation of those policies are structured as if the victims have done something wrong. And somehow it wasn't the system that failed, it wasn't the policy that failed, but it was their inability to do what needed to be done. And until we confront that, I think we're not going to be able, as Dr. Gale said, to remember the faces behind the numbers.
Yeah, well, I think that leads me to my next question here, is that, you know, thinking about the policymakers, right, and the steps that they're going to be putting in place to help support a stronger economic recovery, is it really economic recovery if women are simply going back to these low-wage, unstable jobs? And Noreen, I'd love to start with you and your perspective on that.
We haven't had economic gain since the Clinton administration has started touting that as long as you have a job, we're on the right path. A job is not a job unless it pays you a wage that gives you dignity, that gives you security, that lets you put a roof over your family's head, and doesn't keep you up at night asking yourself, how are you going to explain to your child that there is no milk for their cereal in the morning? And until we understand that that's falling disproportionately to women, particularly women of color, this is not a recovery. It's a Band-Aid, and it makes policymakers feel better about themselves. But in reality, these women are just being victimized over and over again, and we're not fixing anything to make the lives of these women and their families any better.
Yeah. I was just going to add, I think it's a good point. I mean, I think and it's not just Chicago, but the nation, really ought to challenge ourselves around this notion of recovery, because I think, recovery basically says, can you get back to where you were? And I think we have a responsibility and an opportunity to really build, as the saying goes, build back better. How can we actually build the kind of resiliency into our communities so that the next shock doesn't put us back in the same sort of situation? Oh, Congresswoman has joined us.
Welcome. Yeah, well, welcome, Congresswoman Underwood. We're glad to have you. We're in the midst of sort of having a lively discussion here about what policymakers need to do so that we don't just get back to where we were. And, considering that if women are simply going back to low wage, unstable jobs, is that really what we want to focus on? And so, Dr. Gale, I know you're talking about what we need to do too. I know that maybe I'll start with my next question here was really about the Chicago Community Trust's ambitious goal to close the racial and ethnic wealth gap here. Do you want to talk a little bit about how that might, how you see that playing into this building back better concept?
Sure. And, about 18 months or so ago, we launched our strategy around building, around closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap, with the idea that if we could do something about this wealth inequality that in Chicago, like in so many places around the nation, is linked to a history of racial segregation and discrimination. And if we could really make an impact on that, it would go a long way to impacting other issues, health, education, public safety, et cetera, because we know that underneath all of those things is the lack of economic opportunity and the lack of economic stability that exists at a household as well as at a neighborhood level. So we said this is core, this is fundamental, and we would put a focus on this. And then COVID hit. And I think it highlighted for many people why this was so critical in ways that I think people didn't necessarily recognize before. And so I think COVID has added a level of urgency to this issue of closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap. We're focused on ways in which you can build household wealth, how we can help to incentivize investment in disinvested communities, and how we can help to give residents voice so that they are actually at the table when decisions are being made about their futures, and shift the narratives around our communities to focus on our assets, not our deficits, and really build from that. So, we've really put together a strategy that focuses on household, neighborhood, and community. And now with COVID, those issues are even more urgent, and we're, really accelerating in some ways what we were already doing to make sure that we can bring in the right kind of resources and really look at this notion of how do you build back better? How do you build the kind of resiliency so that communities don't keep falling further and further behind and having the very things that we talked about before? So, we're going to continue working with all of our partners on these issues, and, think that we've got an opportunity, given some of the things that we did during with the CARES Act and money, and doing things that we never thought we would do. Giving people checks, extending unemployment to a range of workers, really thinking about issues of the digital divide and how we make sure that people have access to broadband. I mean, there are a lot of things that we've done in this moment of crisis that we could just figure out the will to do them longer term so that we have this more sustained impact of providing financial stability to families and to communities.
I think that's a great time to ask Congresswoman Underwood too to weigh in here, right? It's clear that our institutions and our policies haven't adequately supported working mothers in the past. But how can we address these challenges? It clearly isn't going to be just the philanthropic sector on its own. So what do you see as being really important to this from the policy perspective?
Well, this is the responsibility of good government, right? To make sure that no one falls through the cracks, no one gets left behind. And when we have systems level problems, as we're describing here, we have to have systems level solutions. Part of that comes with accountability. Part of that means policy making with those most vulnerable in mind, and then correcting programmatic issues as they arise, right? Programs that may need to be updated or expanded or what have you. And so we've been really active doing a lot of that work, even during COVID-19. I think that there's been a heavy emphasis on these large packages, the CARES Act, the American Rescue Plan, which we will be voting on finalizing tomorrow. But in the meantime, we've also been legislating to protect women and other workers and vulnerable communities across the country. Let's talk about this American Rescue Plan very quickly. We're going to have the rental and mortgage assistance, right? So in healthcare, right, Dr. Gale's a healthcare professional, and I don't know if others are on this call, but we talk about social determinants of health, right? These factors that are so key in enabling the American people to live healthy, well lives. Housing is key to that, right? So in a pandemic, we have to provide for people's basic foundational needs. We do that in this package. We talk about healthcare relief, right? People couldn't afford healthcare before the pandemic, and now certainly it's extraordinarily difficult for folks to afford their premiums. That kind of assistance is in this package. And obviously we're focused on getting the pandemic under control. Now let's zoom out for a second. Beyond this crisis, we know that we have to ensure that in every workplace, right, women have access to high quality, affordable childcare. We have $40 billion in this COVID-19 package to address childcare issues that are pandemic related, but think about the down payment that makes to help expand access all across our country and the communities that we all serve. Guaranteeing equal treatment for folks under the law by passing the Equal Rights Amendment, right? We have to do paycheck fairness and paycheck equity through the Paycheck Fairness Act. Paid family leave, which is something that we have been working on for decades, but now might be a really powerful moment to get it across the finish line. Obviously, we talked about healthcare and economic security in retirement, right? There's such an emphasis on getting folks, 65 and older vaccinated. And the key for some of them is that the vaccine is free, because this economic piece is something that doesn't just end when we stop talking about working Americans, right? Folks need to have the resources even in their retirements. And so when I think about this issue and the role of government, it has to be comprehensive. We have to be inclusive of everybody, and we have to be willing to solve problems that we see right before us.
Thank you, Congresswoman. We've got a couple of questions from the audience, and I'll just remind folks that if you do have questions, please submit them through the Q&A function. One of the related questions that we've seen here from our audience here are related to age discrimination for mothers who want to go back to the workforce post-pandemic, and the idea of inclusion and discrimination not only impacting races, but age. Does anyone want to weigh in on that?
Absolutely. So when you think about age discrimination, there's a law against that. And so much of what we can do has to do with addressing that and ensuring that people, one, are aware of that law and that they have access to addressing that law through the EEOC and through other state agencies that are contemplated to do that. But places like the Urban League can ensure that people are aware of it so that they do have access to the workforce because they are forced out or because they opt out for a time because it's the best thing for their families.
And we were talking a lot about sort of this building resiliency, and not just getting back to sort of where we were before. We talked about housing stability. We talked about, community development strategies to get people more stabilized in their environments. Noreen, maybe from Latino Policy Forum's perspective, are there other things that you're working on related to those policies?
Well, one of the things that we've been saying since actually the first week of April is along the lines of what Dr. Gale was talking about with the trust. We've been using the word reimagine, that instead of returning, let's reimagine what fairness and what equity looks like. Let's not talk about equality, let's talk about equity. Let's make sure that people have what they need to survive, and let's make sure that they have what they need to succeed and to live with some dignity. And even going back to the age question, it harps back to something we think a lot about. How do we set up policies so that the burden is not on the victim? So if a woman is discriminated against, she's got to be the one going to the EEOC. It all falls on her. Is there a way to reimagine how policies can be managed and incentive structures can be set up so that those people who have been victimized for a long time are not further victimized because they're trying to just take care of themselves and their families? And I think that's some of the way we're talking about. The other thing that I think we've been really focused on, and this is a difficult one, we talk about, like many do, what COVID broke, exacerbated, and exposed. One of the things that I don't think is getting enough attention is what COVID broke was the tenacity and the ability, particularly of women of color who are on the economic margins, to make it. That's been taken from them because of the economic condition. And we're not understanding that this short-term, day-to-day inability to meet families is really got to be addressed head on.
I saw everyone sort of nodding along with you there, Karen.
Erin, we are a society that loves Band-Aids. You think about it as kids, I've got a little scratch, I need a Band-Aid, but the greater implication is that we like to fix just problems on the surface. The opportunity, and I think Dr. Gale has said it, Congresswoman Underwood has said it, Noreen has said it, the opportunity that we have here is not to use Band-Aids, but to really fix it, to get a suture out, to do the surgical solution, to make sure that we undo the structures that have given rise to the problems that COVID has simply unmasked, but also to fix it in a way that when the next disruption comes, because we know that there will be another disruption, that we are not as vulnerable as women, that we're not as susceptible to the disruption as families, and that there are permanent, better structures in place that will allow women to thrive and to do the things that we count on them to do.
Yeah, I would just, we've talked a lot about how much women carry and how much women multitask and how many different roles that women do without the supports that they have. And, when I think about reimagining, I think about reimagining a world where women who have this incredible potential, and we know that because of all the things women juggle, what if we gave them the supports to actually be able to do what they could do if they didn't have to juggle so many things, if they didn't have so many stresses in their lives, if they didn't have to worry about, whether their children got fed, whether they have childcare, whether they can juggle all these things. Imagine a world where 50% of our population really had the opportunity to use their skills in the best way possible and move forward and not always having to be saddled. And, I think sometimes we're so used to women carrying these huge burdens and just thinking that it's okay. Well, imagine what we would be like as a society if women didn't have to be overburdened and just did their share. We would gain so much for our economy, for our society, for our children, if we just took some of these undue burdens off of women and let women thrive. And so, in a lot of ways, what we're saying is let women have the opportunity to thrive. Let us rebalance our societies so that we really do have this notion of equity, as you said, Noreen, so that people had what they needed, not just what was left over, and women could actually thrive and really fully participate in our society in the way that we know they could. We would have a different society. And that's where that's what I hope we can get to.
And what you've just said, Dr. Gale, actually underscores we have to rethink incentives. We don't need to incentivize women to go to work, to take care of their kids, to do everything. We have to reimagine the incentive structure so that our institutions do exactly what you've just laid out. We seem to have a misaligned incentive structure given the social problems that we have and the inequities that we have.
But let me just add, and if it were women who were the sole decision makers on this problem would have been solved a long time ago. But let's face it,
Amen.
Men have to buy into these changes. These changes aren't going to just happen with the wave of a wand. It has to happen in a way that men really do embrace doing things differently, making different decisions. And many of them do, don't get me wrong, but it has to happen on a much more widespread basis.
I think that's a good segue. Sorry, Dr. Gale, go ahead.
Sorry, I don't mean to prolong it, but for about a decade, I headed CARE, the International Humanitarian Organization, where we put focusing on girls and women as our highest priority because we knew that that was really the way to solve and end global poverty. And, when I talk to women in some of the most poorest remote countries around the world, and women who had the opportunity to start a business and to make a difference in their homes, and I would ask them, well, what do your husbands think? And these are in societies where women were traditionally not able to, earn an income. And I'd ask them, I said, well, does your husband in this very conservative society like the fact that you're working, that you have a business? And they would all say, we love it because our wives are now contributing to the family. And their relationships changed because she was no longer subservient and was seen as something of value. And so I guess to Karen's point, I think this is about how do we rebalance our societies, and men gain as well. This is not a zero-sum game. If women win and do better, men do better as well. Families do better as well, and our society will do better as well.
I think exactly what your point at the end is where I wanted to take us is that, all of these inequities that we're talking about, I know specifically today we're talking about women, but, we're talking about community development, we're talking about housing, we're talking about access to healthcare, and I think oftentimes the argument becomes, how do we either spread things evenly so everybody gets equal, but we've been talking about equity, which goes beyond that. And so how do we have thoughtful conversations about moving the needle? What is it's not just about, it may be about women in the moment, but how does that benefit everyone else? And I'll start with you, Congresswoman Underwood, if that's okay.
Sure. I think that we've jump-started a conversation that we've been having among ourselves for a long time, but now it's happening out loud, so to speak. And at least I'll say in some of my community, everybody's not on board with equity and they feel left out, and they don't understand how it helps them and their families and their immediate surroundings. And so I think that part of it is just having inclusive conversations. It's not leaving anybody out. Nobody's getting more than someone else. Nobody's getting ahead and being left behind. I mean, it's actually the opposite. And I think that, we've had this national conversation really, at least in the COVID context, for about little less than 2 months, right? With the start of the Biden administration. And I think that, there's been some progress made, but a long ways to go. And so it's my hope that moving forward, as we have non-pandemic examples, other successes, that we're not just talking to the communities that, the policymakers wish to benefit. So for example, if we are trying to solve an issue for communities of color and access to care, access to resources, or for women, right, it shouldn't just be a conversation with those communities of color or just with women. It needs to be a conversation with everybody. And we need to be disciplined and repetitive and persistent in having that conversation for everybody, because at least the perceived sacrifice is happening across the board. And so, I hope that we continue to be united in this quest towards equity. I really do. But I wonder if we're going to ultimately be successful if we don't fix this messaging problem.
Mm-hmm. I think you're absolutely right. And this is sort of a debate that I often have with my 27-year-old, because her position is, who cares what they think? And I'm like, it does matter, because at the end of the day, if we're going to really come up with a long-term solution, one that everyone embraces, then the messaging has to be that when you fix something here, it helps everyone. And to provide concrete examples of why that matters and why that's important.
So in response to that, as a mom, my question is, how hard is it to communicate? And communication people should be able to do this. If the child in a different community is successful, has opportunity, contributes what they have to offer, my child's life is better and their life is better as well. It's this idea that we haven't convinced people that raising up communities that have been so hard hit and have suffered such discrimination and inequities actually not betters them, but it betters the life of your own children and potentially your own grandchildren if you're going to have them. And that's the kind of message that I don't see. I think that's what Congressman Underwood was speaking about. We've got to convince people that this is important.
Yeah, and I think we've got to get people out of this zero-sum game thinking.
Sure.
There have been some really wonderful reports that have come out recently from Citibank, from McKinsey, and
yeah.
other non-social justice organizations. These are not your social justice organizations. These are businesses, and they talk about the trillions of dollars that will be added to our U.S. economy if we close the racial and ethnic wealth gap. So this is not about, yes, it's the right thing to do, it's the fair thing to do, it's the just thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do for our economy. As we've talked about our work here in Chicago with the trust, with our focus on closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap, for many audiences, what I say, it's the math. You have 2/3 of your population, Black and brown, that you're holding back. The math doesn't work for us to move forward as a region when you're holding 2/3 of the population's potential back. The numbers just don't add up. So I do think we have to start thinking about not talking to ourselves figure out how we get people out of these zero-sum game thinking and recognize that the things that we're talking about when we talk about equity, it benefits everybody. It benefits our whole society. And I think that's, we've got to get better at making those arguments.
I think too, one of the questions that we got that Dr. Gale, you started to address in advance of getting it was just about how policymakers have seen examples from around the world as to how this can benefit societies. You touched on how, you know, men in the country that you were working with saw that women could add to the economy. Are there other examples locally or globally that you would point to as opportunities for us to learn from? That could be Dr. Gale or anyone else.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, you know, if you look at most any other industrialized nation where support for women in the workplace, childcare, parental leave, which, you know, affects men and women, et cetera, we know that those economies have continued to have economic growth and don't have a lot of the social challenges that we have in, you know, in our own country. You know, we've got to figure it out our own way. There is no one model that works for every nation, but I think we can take a page from other countries where there are more of a safety net, where there is more support for women in the workplace, where you know, families don't have to make a lot of the sacrifices that we have here. And think about how do you adapt some of those things for our own context? Because, you know, clearly example after example demonstrates that if you give people basic needs, the things that they need to survive and have stability, those societies all do better. You know, you can look at our incarceration rates, you can look at our homelessness rates, you can look at our health and health outcomes. I mean, we spend more on health than any other nation in the world, and we get the least from our health system when we look at life expectancy and disease rates. So there's a lot that we can learn from other countries, and we figure out how we adapt it for our own situation and who we are as a nation.
I think another area too that I'm curious to hear your responses about is that, you know, when we look at the occupations that women are in, and specifically Latinas and Black women, right? They're very much service oriented. They're nurse, you know, retail, their healthcare, hospitality jobs, you know, and we've seen a lot of the pandemic's impacts on some of these jobs as accelerating areas where they were probably going to get to in the next, you know, couple decades. But so how do we, as policymakers, think about that next sort of stepping stone to getting people back to work beyond sort of retail, healthcare, you know, basic jobs that maybe don't provide for flexibility and income and wages that are necessary to lift people out of poverty?
I think that goes clearly to the earlier conversation, one about the social determinants of health, but also about what are we going to do differently in the future. And so now we have an opportunity to provide training, to provide support for women to think about, to look at new careers, and careers that have the opportunity to allow them to build wealth, to save money, to pass that on to their children in a way that they've not maybe had the opportunity or luxury of thinking about before, because they took the jobs, they worked in the jobs that they needed to support their families. But now that they've been forced to take a pause because those jobs have laid them off, those jobs no longer exist, what are the opportunities that are provided from organizations like the Chicago Urban League, like other training organizations that will allow them to now gain careers that are much more sustainable for their families?
To that point, Karen, I think we can look to, I think of healthcare as an example. In my former life, I did a lot of research on healthcare labor. And there are places around the country that have taken particularly Black women and Latinas who came into healthcare doing nurse aide jobs, the lowest pay, the most tenuous job, got them as part of the job into community college, got them to either an RN program or a vocational nursing program, created resources. And I think we need to look back at some of those smaller community-based initiatives where there've been small successes and kind of learn how to scale it up. And that speaks to your point that, you know, how are we using our community colleges? How are we using those resources to actually train people? Community colleges are far more than a family saving tuition for 2 years. They should be the epicenter of what is going on with women who have been impacted by COVID. I'm not saying you have to have even an associate's degree, but the training and the credentialing to get you into the door of these companies.
And I agree with you. Go ahead, Congresswoman.
The only thing I would add is I want to kind of separate out, you know, there are tremendous opportunities in all of the sectors that you mentioned, but some of those jobs didn't offer the kind of protections for the workers that they need, right? And so there's opportunities to make those jobs better, offer more robust protection for all workers. This week, we're going to be voting on something called the PRO Act, which is the strongest collective bargaining legislation that's come through the Congress in a generation. It's very exciting. I think that there's opportunities no matter which sector to make sure that workers have their rights protected, et cetera. Secondly, I will say that in the last Congress, we voted on some legislation to make community college tuition free. And that would transform this idea of creating pipelines and pathways for career transitions, for people to have skill sets and portability in their credentialing, and give folks an opportunity to do the work in a flexible way. Because as we all know, the average age of a college student, whether it's community college or a 4-year higher education institution, is not 18. They're like 27 or 32, somewhere in that range, right? And so these are people with lives and families, and it might not fit this nice, neat, linear path that, you know, some folks often think of. And then the last thing I'll say is that for so long, people have just been trying to survive. And I think that this conversation has to acknowledge the choices that people make when survival, including during the pandemic, is just the goal, right? Advancing in your career is a dream sometimes when you're just trying to survive. And so creating a structure where, you know, we can allow folks to chase their dreams, everybody to have an opportunity to chase their dreams, is something that I certainly want to continue to support. But I think that, you know, we need to create a system that offers opportunity for everyone. And I think that, you know, as we talk about recovery from the pandemic and a jobs program and infrastructure investments and all of that, you'll start to see some of those incentives realign, but hopefully we do it in a way that works for working women versus just, you know, other sectors which may not be as attractive to women and families.
Well, you know, one of the things that I wanted to just sort of end on a higher note, what for each of you, I'd like to go around and ask you, you know, what keeps you going? Is there a particular story of a woman in this region that has inspired you to continue to do the hard work and the good work that all of your agencies are doing? And maybe I'll start with you, Dr. Gale.
Yeah, well, first of all, I guess I continue to have hope because, you know, I know what what women can accomplish. You know, as I look around this screen of the women who are on, who, you know, are all women doing incredible things, it gives me a lot of courage and inspiration. You know, and I don't have a story, but you know, when I go into the neighborhoods that we work in and talk to people, you know, when we were giving out support, for instance, the emergency relief that we were giving out during COVID, and you would talk to families who just the ability to know that they had food to put on their table was enough to get them up every morning, enough to give them hope and encouragement. And I guess, understanding how little it takes and, what it would mean if we could just give basic security to women and, to everybody in our country, just give those basic rights and that, I think people deserve to be able to give back to their families, to their community. And so for me, I just gain hope and inspiration when I look around and realize what we're able to do when we've got such an uphill battle. And if we could just remove some of that stress, some of that burden, and unleash the power of women, there is no stopping us. And that's what gives me inspiration.
For sharing. Karen, how about you?
So similarly, and I had an opportunity to work with the Black McDonald's operators when they were giving out baskets during the Thanksgiving or Christmas holiday, and just seeing faces, and you start to look at eyes a lot more because everybody is masked up, right? And the relief in people's eyes that you see, whether you're giving out PPE or food or any of the essentials, is always a source of encouragement. But, my greatest inspiration starts at home every day. Many people know that I'm a caregiver. My mother is a 6-time stroke survivor. And to be able to go in her room and see her just doing it every day and determined to embrace life is a tremendous inspiration to me daily.
That's amazing. Thank you, Karen, for sharing. Noreen?
I think there's not one woman's story, but it's really a conglomerate of women who are able to do what has to be done every day. But there is a woman who was a mentor to me when I was a graduate student, a woman named Dr. Effie Ellis, who is no longer with us. Dr. Ellis was one of the first Black women to be a pediatric resident at the University of Illinois Hospital. And what she taught me actually speaks to what Karen just said. Look in the eyes of children. And if that doesn't keep you going, look at the eyes of their mothers, recognize how lucky you are, and keep it moving.
I love that. I love that. Thank you so much. Congressman Underwood.
My community, it's been the women who have been the agents of change. They are on the pulse. They are driving forward every ounce of progress in our community. They have not necessarily run for office, but they run every single civic group and organization. They're starting businesses, right? These ladies are bosses. And I have the opportunity very routinely to be in touch with so many across the district. And what has been an inspiration to me is that in a time of such need and challenge, right, that we can continue to stay close and that we can continue to stay in touch and make sure that their needs and their families' needs are being met. So often, I think that so many people feel unseen and unheard by policymakers. They feel like, things are happening to them or decisions are being made for them and they don't have input. And I'm just grateful that during this time, which has been so tough and so devastating, right, we haven't allowed that kind of distance to creep in. And so I'd like to invite everyone who, would like to be in touch with us to please feel free to do so, but also for your representatives. And, it is Women's Day. And I think that, we are a state, we are a community that has some incredibly dynamic female leaders, and that we should not take for granted how lucky we are in our community to have such wide-ranging examples of women's leadership and talent, and what a difference it's made in all of our lives. And I got so many stories to tell you about the women leaders in my life, and I know the other women do as well. Thank you.
On this
Aaron,
women,
if I may, sorry.
Go ahead.
If I may, and I hope nobody takes this as a political statement, but one of the things that inspires me is a young woman like Congresswoman Underwood. You know, for me
Absolutely.
to see young women who have said, you know, I am willing to put myself out there, and it is tough running for office, and willing to put themselves out there and be unabashed about the things they stand for, that gives me incredible inspiration as a woman of a different generation to see this
Sure.
young generation coming up, moving forward, being real clear about what they stand for and representing all of us so well. So, you know, just to say, hats off to you. You are one clearly up there as one of my inspirations.
And on this International
That's fair.
Women's Day, I'd like to acknowledge basically, with or without the degree, all women are structural engineers. They structure family life, they structure family life, they structure church life, they structure community, they structure businesses, they structure healthcare, they structure government, they structure philanthropy. And it's a shame we can't credential them all for the skills they have.
Absolutely.
Well, we're also experts at logistics and distribution as well, because I feel like that's also part of my daily responsibilities at home, right?
Every day.
That's right. Not to mention social secretary.
That's right. Well, I am looking forward to getting back to being an even more engaged social secretary after the pandemic. I'm, you know, heartened that there's some light at the end of the tunnel, but I will say that today's conversation for me really highlighted that we have work to do today, and we have work to do in the long term too, right? It's not just about tomorrow, but it's about, you know, putting in place the best public policies to help women, you know, Black women, Latinas across the country, and specifically in our region, and also just to make sure that families and people are able to have their essential needs met. So thank you so much to our panelists, to Congresswoman Underwood for joining us, Dr. Gale, Mayor Freeman Wilson, Noreen Shuguru, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. We'll be posting the video on YouTube, and we'll see if we can get our hands on some of those reports that Dr. Gale mentioned, and Noreen and Karen as well, and get those posted to share, because I know we had some questions about those. So thank you. I've been inspired. Happy International Women's Day.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Laura, the work that you do, Erin, and for CMAP for having us.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure's all mine. Have a great day.
Take care.